Sometime around 1900 BCE, the palace at Knossos on the island of Crete contained a set of administrative records, not stone inscriptions, not painted murals, but clay tablets pressed with a script no one had yet named. These tablets recorded transactions, livestock, grain, oil, in a writing system that would later be called Linear A. Thousands of such tablets have since been found across Minoan sites, and not one of them has been deciphered. This is the opening condition of any serious inquiry into Minoan civilization. At its center sits a writing system that has resisted every attempt at translation for more than a century. Not because researchers have avoided it, not because the tablets are rare or poorly preserved, but because Linear A does not resolve. The signs exist, the patterns exist, the comparative materials exist, and still the meaning stays sealed. That silence is not a detail at the edge of Minoan history. It is the center of it. When Arthur Evans excavated Knossos, beginning in 1900, he expected to find evidence of a civilization. What he did not expect, what perhaps no one was fully prepared for, was a civilization whose central administrative and possibly ritual language would remain opaque more than a century after its physical traces were uncovered. Evans named these people the Minoans, after the legendary King Minos of Greek myth. He gave them an identity borrowed from a story about them told by people who came after them and may not have understood them at all. The choice of that name is its own kind of problem. The Minoans did not call themselves Minoans. Whatever they called themselves, whatever name they used in those unread tablets, has not survived in any translated form. The label they carry through history was applied by an outsider who was reading a later mythology. Beneath the name, the people remain unnamed in their own voice. Evans' excavations were transformative, and also, in the view of some later researchers, premature in their interpretations. He reconstructed portions of the palace at Knossos, physically rebuilt walls, added concrete, repainted frescoes, in ways that blended archaeological inference with artistic imagination. Some of what visitors see at Knossos today reflects Evans' vision of what the Minoans were, not necessarily what the evidence alone would have yielded. The site that stands as the primary anchor for Minoan civilization has been, to some extent, shaped by a single man's interpretation of it. That alone would not be a crisis. Reconstruction happens at many ancient sites. But at Knossos, the reconstruction sits on top of a civilization whose written language cannot be read. There is no text that corrects the reconstruction. There is no royal decree, no administrative letter, no religious hymn that says, "This is wrong," or "This is right," or "This is what we actually meant." The palace rises, the frescoes glow in their restored colors, and the writing on the tablets next to them stays closed. What remains, then, is a civilization known almost entirely through its material remains, its architecture, its pottery, its paintings, its trade goods, its burial practices. These are not nothing. They are in many ways extraordinary, but they are also mute in a specific way. They show what the Minoans made and where they lived and approximately how they organized their economy. They do not, in any recoverable sense, say what the Minoans believed, what they feared, what stories they told about the world, or how they understood their own collapse. Because collapse is where this investigation eventually arrives, no matter which path through Minoan history is taken. Around 1450 BCE, Minoan palatial culture ends with an abruptness that the archaeological record registers clearly but does not fully explain. Sites are destroyed. Some are abandoned. The writing system changes. A new group, most researchers now believe these were Mycenaean Greeks, appears to take administrative control of Knossos, and suddenly the tablets at that site are written in a different script, Linear B, which was deciphered in 1952 and turns out to be an early form of Greek. Linear A did not evolve into Linear B. The scripts share some signs, but the languages beneath them appear to be different. One was replaced by the other, and the one that was replaced has still not spoken. That is where this begins. The question of what happened to the Minoans around 1450 BCE has occupied researchers for decades, and the answers that have been proposed are numerous enough to suggest that none of them is fully satisfying. Volcanic eruption, earthquake, invasion, internal collapse, climate disruption. Each hypothesis arrives with evidence in its favor and leaves with objections it cannot resolve. The fact that so many competing explanations remain in circulation is itself a kind of signal. When the record is clear, debate tends to narrow. When the record is genuinely incomplete, the field stays open. The volcanic eruption of Thera, the island now known as Santorini, roughly 110 kilometers north of Crete, was for a long time the leading candidate for the catastrophe that ended Minoan civilization. The eruption was real. It was massive, one of the largest volcanic events of the Holocene, capable of generating tsunamis, ash clouds, and disruptions to agriculture across the eastern Mediterranean. For decades, many researchers assumed a direct causal link. Thera erupted, the Minoans were destroyed, and what followed was a civilization in ruins. The problem is the dating. As archaeologists and volcanologists refine their methods, the eruption of Thera was pushed progressively further back in time. Ice core evidence, radiocarbon dating, and dendrochronological records have led many researchers to date the eruption to somewhere between 1620 and 1500 BCE, with some estimates clustering around 1628 BCE. If that dating is correct, the eruption preceded the destruction of the Minoan palatial sites by more than a century. A civilization does not collapse a century after its catastrophe and leave no trace of recovery in between. And Minoan sites do show signs of continued activity after the likely eruption date. So either the dating is wrong, and some researchers still argue this, or the eruption and the collapse are separate events connected by something more complicated than simple cause and effect. The eruption may have weakened Minoan infrastructure, disrupted trade, destabilized agriculture in ways that played out over generations. Or it may have been a significant event that the Minoans survived and then later succumbed to something else entirely. The record does not resolve this cleanly. What the record does show with reasonable clarity is a pattern of destruction across multiple Minoan sites around 1450 BCE. Akrotiri, on Thera itself, was buried by the eruption and preserved in volcanic ash in a way that made it sometimes called the Aegean Pompeii, its streets and buildings sealed beneath meters of pumice, its population apparently evacuated before the worst of the eruption, leaving behind frescoes of extraordinary quality, but almost no human remains and almost no valuables. The absence of bodies and portable wealth at Akrotiri has been noted by researchers as unusual for a sudden, catastrophic burial. It suggests forewarning. It suggests departure. It does not tell us where those people went. On Crete itself, the destruction horizon around 1450 BCE is visible at sites including Zakros, Malea, Phaistos, and others. These sites show signs of fire and abandonment. Knossos, notably, does not show the same destruction at the same time. Knossos continues, and the tablets at Knossos after this period are written in linear B, not linear A. That continuation is one of the most discussed anomalies in Aegean prehistory. Why did one palace survive when the others did not? Some researchers argue that Knossos survived because it was taken over, that Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland moved into a weakened Crete and established administrative control at its most prominent site, using the palace infrastructure that was already there. This would explain the linear B tablets. They represent the accounting system of a new ruling group, not a continuation of Minoan administration. Others argue the transition was more gradual, more collaborative, perhaps more ambiguous than a clean conquest narrative implies. The linear B tablets at Knossos record grain and livestock and military equipment and personnel. They are legible. They are in Greek, and they tell almost nothing about what preceded them in the same rooms, in the same storage corridors, in the same palace where linear A tablets had been pressed into clay by hands that belonged to people whose language is still waiting to be understood. 2 scripts, 1 building, one of them readable, one of them not. The asymmetry is almost architectural in its precision. Linear A appears at sites across Crete and at several Aegean islands pressed into clay tablets, inscribed on stone vessels, painted onto pottery, scratched into metal objects. It spans roughly 5 centuries of use, from approximately 1800 BCE to around 1450 BCE. It is not a rare survival. There are currently several hundred tablets and thousands of additional inscribed objects that carry its signs. Researchers have cataloged them carefully. The sign inventory has been established. The direction of writing, left to right, is known. The fact that it is a syllabic script, like its successor Linear B, is generally accepted. And yet the language underneath it remains unidentified in any confirmed sense. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely unusual in the landscape of ancient, undeciphered scripts. Linear A is not isolated from all context. Linear B, which shares a significant number of its signs, was deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952 and revealed to encode an early form of Greek. Because the 2 scripts share signs, researchers have been able to apply the phonetic values of linear B signs to their linear A equivalents, producing approximate sound values for many linear A symbols. This means linear A can be partially sounded out. Words can be pronounced approximately. Some sequences recur in ways that suggest administrative categories, tallies, totals, commodity lists, that parallel the structure of linear B tablets. And still, the meaning stays closed. Because sounding out a word is not the same as understanding it. The language beneath linear A does not appear to be Greek. It does not appear to be any known language family with enough certainty for the field to reach consensus. Some researchers have proposed connections to other ancient languages of the Aegean or Anatolia. Others have explored possible links to languages spoken in Cyprus or the Levant. None of these proposals has achieved broad acceptance. The language encoded in Linear A is, in the current state of the evidence, a language without a confirmed relative. There is a term sometimes used for this kind of linguistic isolation: a language isolate. Modern examples include Basque, spoken in the borderlands of Spain and France, which shows no confirmed relationship to any other surviving language. But Basque is still spoken. Its speakers can be interviewed. Its grammar can be observed in living use. The language of Linear A exists only in its inscriptions, and those inscriptions are almost entirely administrative. Even if the language were decoded tomorrow, the surviving texts would tell researchers about grain allocations and livestock counts, not about mythology, not about ritual, not about how the Minoans describe their own world to themselves. This is the second layer of silence beneath the first. Even decipherment, if it came, would open a door into a storage room. The library, if there ever was one, has not survived. Some researchers have noted that the Minoans may have used perishable writing materials alongside clay tablets, wooden boards, papyrus, or other organic surfaces that would not survive in the archaeological record. This is not an unusual practice in the ancient world. The relative abundance of Linear A on clay may reflect the accidents of preservation rather than the full range of Minoan textual production. If administrative records survived because they were accidentally fired during destruction events, as often happened when clay tablets were hardened by the fires that burned the buildings around them, then the absence of literary or religious texts in Linear A may simply mean those texts were written on materials that burned completely. That explanation is reasonable. It is also, in a particular way, cold comfort. It means the loss was total, not restricted, not buried, not waiting in an unopened archive, but gone, burned with the buildings, dissolved in the soil, the materials that carried the Minoan interior life, if such materials existed, left no trace. What survives are the frescoes, and the frescoes, in their own way, are as difficult to read as the tablets. They show scenes of remarkable vividness, bull leaping, processions, marine life, landscapes of lilies and swallows, figures in elaborate dress. They show what appears to be ritual activity, though the nature of that ritual remains contested. They show a world that seems, at a visual level, unusually peaceful for a Bronze Age palace culture. There is almost no unambiguous depiction of warfare in Minoan frescoes, almost no clear image of a king in military posture, no triumph scene, no conquered enemy. That absence, too, is a kind of writing. It just does not say what it means. The absence of warfare imagery in Minoan art has been observed and debated for decades, and the interpretations it has generated reveal as much about the interpreters as about the Minoans themselves. Early 20th century scholarship, influenced heavily by Evans, tended to read this absence as evidence of a peaceful, matriarchal, nature-worshipping society, a kind of Bronze Age utopia presided over by goddess figures, and free from the martial hierarchies that characterized contemporaneous cultures in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and mainland Greece. This reading was attractive. It was also, in the view of many later researchers, substantially a projection. The problem is not that the evidence contradicts a peaceful Minoan society outright. The problem is that the evidence is insufficient to confirm it, and the leap from no clear warfare imagery to a fundamentally peaceful civilization is considerably longer than it first appears. Absence of representation is not the same as absence of practice. Egyptian temple walls are covered in military imagery, in part because Egyptian rulers used such imagery to communicate power and legitimacy. If Minoan rulers communicated power differently, through ceremony, through economic control, through religious authority, then the absence of battle scenes in their art might say more about their political aesthetics than about whether violence occurred. There are, in fact, signs that violence was not absent from Minoan life. Skeletal remains from some Minoan sites show trauma consistent with violent injury. There is evidence of what some researchers interpret as human sacrifice at a site called Anemospilia, where the remains of what appeared to be a sacrificial victim and the people performing the ritual were found together, apparently killed by a sudden structural collapse, possibly during an earthquake, around 1700 BCE. This interpretation has been disputed, and the site's evidence is not universally accepted as proof of human sacrifice. But the discussion itself complicates the image of Minoan civilization as uniformly gentle. The Anemospilia site is, in its own way, a small archive of contradiction. The building was not a palace. It was a freestanding shrine, one of very few confirmed examples of a purpose-built Minoan religious structure identified outside a palatial complex. Its interior contained evidence of ritual activity, painted cult vessels, and the skeletal remains at the center of the debate. The earthquake that destroyed it, if that is indeed what happened, preserved its final moment in a way that most Minoan sites were not preserved, a snapshot of interrupted practice, frozen mid-gesture. And even that snapshot is contested. What the frescoes do show clearly, and what requires no interpretive leap, is a society with sophisticated aesthetic sensibility, complex ritual life, and hierarchical social organization. The so-called procession fresco at Knossos, fragmentary as it is, depicts figures carrying vessels and moving in ordered progression toward what appears to be a central focal point. The investiture or gift-giving scenes suggest ceremony organized around status and offering. The bull-leaping scenes, which show figures of varying apparent gender vaulting over charging bulls, suggest either an athletic ritual, a religious practice, a courtly display, or some combination that does not map cleanly onto any single modern category. The bull itself appears throughout Minoan iconography with a frequency that clearly marks it as significant. Bull horns rendered in stone and placed on architectural elements appear at Knossos and other sites. The connection between the bull and the later Greek myth of the Minotaur, the half-bull creature kept in the labyrinth beneath Knossos, has been noted since Evans' time. Evans himself believed the myth preserved a distorted memory of Minoan bull ritual. Others have been more cautious, noting that Greek myths about Crete were composed centuries after Minoan civilization ended, by people who had no access to Minoan texts, and may have been elaborating on material that had already passed through multiple layers of transformation. The myth of the labyrinth is particularly tangled. The word labyrinth itself may derive from the Minoan word labris, meaning double axe, a symbol that appears throughout Minoan art and architecture with a regularity that suggests deep symbolic importance. The double axe is carved into the stone pillars at Knossos. It appears on pottery, on frescoes, on seal stones. If the labyrinth is literally the house of the double axe, then the mythology may encode something architectural, something real about the palace's physical complexity. The palace at Knossos is, by any measure, a remarkably intricate structure, multi-storied, multi-courted, full of corridors and storage magazines and light wells that would have made navigation genuinely disorienting to an outsider. But a disorienting palace is not a labyrinth in the mythological sense, and a bull-leaping ritual is not a minotaur. The distance between what the archaeology shows and what the mythology says remains wide, and in that distance, interpretation fills the space that evidence cannot. The seal stones of the Minoans are among the most concentrated repositories of information about their world, and among the most resistant to straightforward reading. Cut from hard stones, carnelian, agate, jasper, rock crystal, and engraved with scenes of extraordinary miniature precision, they were used to mark ownership and authenticate transactions pressed into soft clay to leave an impression. Thousands have been found, scattered across Crete, the Aegean Islands, mainland Greece, and sites as far as the Levant and Egypt. They circulated widely. They were valued objects, sometimes buried with their owners, sometimes passed down across generations. The scenes engraved on them are dense with imagery that clearly meant something specific to the people who made and used them. Figures in postures that appear ritual or ecstatic, animals in impossible combinations, humans interacting with trees, with altars, with architectural elements in ways that suggest ceremony. A category of seal imagery that researchers have called the Minoan genius, a hybrid creature with leonine or crocodilian features, upright posture, and what appears to be a vessel or offering, recurs across dozens of examples. This figure appears in contexts that suggest a ritual role, but what that role was, what story or belief system it belonged to, is not recoverable from the images alone. The challenge with Minoan iconography is that it is clearly a symbolic system, coherent, repeated, intentional, but it lacks the explanatory text that would allow a reader to move from image to meaning with confidence. In Egyptian art, hieroglyphic inscriptions accompany scenes and name the figures, identify the ritual, specify the deity. In Mesopotamian art, cuneiform labels connect images to a known textual tradition. Minoan art exists largely without that anchoring text. The symbols repeat. The patterns are real, but the key that would unlock their specific content has not survived and may never have been written on a durable surface. Some researchers have approached Minoan iconography through comparison with later Greek religious practice, looking for continuities that might illuminate the earlier material. There are suggestive parallels. A goddess figure with raised arms appears in both Minoan and later Aegean contexts. Certain ritual postures echo across the chronological gap. The snake goddess figurines from Knossos, faience figures of a female form holding snakes in each hand, dressed in elaborate tiered skirts, have been interpreted as cult images, priestess figures, or deity representations, with each interpretation carrying its own set of assumptions about Minoan religion that the figurines themselves do not confirm. The snake goddess figurines also carry a specific problem of provenance. Several of the most famous examples were found not in a controlled excavation context, but in what Evans described as a repository, a pit or cache within the palace that had apparently been gathered and deposited at some point in the past. The circumstances of their deposition, the question of whether they were ritually buried, accidentally lost, or deliberately stored, affects how they should be interpreted, and the excavation methods of Evans' era did not always produce the stratigraphic documentation that later archaeology would require to answer such questions with confidence. This is a recurring structural problem in Minoan studies. Many of the most important objects were excavated in the early decades of the 20th century, before modern standards of stratigraphic recording were fully established. The contextual information that would allow researchers to place objects in their precise relationship to architecture, to other objects, to destruction layers and use phases is sometimes absent or incomplete. Objects exist in museum collections with provenance records that are partial, reconstructed, or in some cases disputed. The physical object survives. The context that would tell its story most fully does not. There is also a category of Minoan objects whose authenticity has been questioned. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Ashmolean, and other institutions hold Minoan pieces acquired through the antiquities market in the early 20th century that have faced scrutiny over the decades. The snake goddess in Boston in particular has been the subject of extended debate about whether it is a genuine Minoan artifact or a sophisticated modern forgery produced to meet the demand that Evans's discoveries created. This debate has not been fully resolved. Some researchers consider the object authentic. Others remain unconvinced. The uncertainty sits quietly in the literature, a small but persistent doubt, attached to one of the most reproduced images of Minoan civilization, an object whose authenticity cannot be confirmed in a language that cannot be read, from a civilization whose name was borrowed from a myth. The layers of mediation accumulate. Each one is individually explicable. Together, they produce a particular kind of distance from the thing itself. Trade is one of the places where Minoan civilization becomes most legible, because trade leaves physical residue that survives the silence of unread scripts. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, in the Levant, in Cyprus, in mainland Greece, in Anatolia. Egyptian tomb paintings from the New Kingdom period depict figures carrying objects that bear unmistakable resemblance to Minoan vessels, and these figures have been identified by some researchers as keftiu, a term used in Egyptian sources to refer to people from a large island to the northwest, almost certainly Crete. The keftiu appear in Egyptian records as tribute bearers or trading partners, arriving with goods and receiving goods in return. They are depicted with a physical appearance and a style of dress that matches what Minoan frescoes show of their own people. This is one of the rare moments where an external source looks directly at the Minoans and records what it sees. The Egyptian sources do not use the word Minoan, of course. They use keftiu. But the convergence of physical description, geographical reference, and material culture makes the identification reasonably secure in the view of most researchers. For a civilization that cannot speak in its own written voice, the Egyptian record offers something valuable, a contemporary outside perspective, however brief and transactional. What the Egyptian sources do not provide is any deep description of Minoan society, belief, or political structure. The keftiu appear in administrative and artistic contexts as trading partners, as bearers of exotic goods. They are documented the way a merchant would be documented, by what they brought, not by who they were. The relationship appears to have been economically significant. Minoan goods were valued. Minoan craftsmanship was recognized. but the record does not extend to the interior of Minoan life. It remains a record of exchange, not of understanding. The trading network that Minoan civilization sustained at its height was extensive enough to suggest a degree of maritime organization and economic reach that implies sophisticated institutional infrastructure. The palace economies of Crete appear to have functioned as redistributive centers, collecting agricultural surplus and craft production from surrounding areas and redistributing them through controlled channels. The linear A tablets, to the extent they can be structurally understood even without translation, show this redistributive pattern clearly. Columns of commodities, numerical tallies, what appear to be place names or personal names functioning as administrative categories. The palace was, among other things, an economic machine. This economic organization raises questions about political structure that the record handles only partially. Were the Minoan palaces, Knossos, Pistos, Malea, Zakros, and others, independent polities competing with one another? Or were they networked under some form of broader coordination, with Knossos perhaps dominant? The material record shows similarities across palatial sites that suggest shared cultural and possibly institutional conventions. But it also shows regional variation, and it shows no clear evidence of the kind of military hierarchy that, in other Bronze Age cultures, would accompany political dominance of one center over others. Some researchers have proposed that Minoan political organization was not territorial in the way that later states were territorial. That control may have been exercised through economic and religious networks rather than through direct military authority. This would help explain the relative absence of fortification walls at early Minoan sites, a feature that contrasts sharply with contemporaneous cultures on the Greek mainland. Mycenaean sites are heavily fortified. Early Minoan sites, at least in the palatial period, are largely not. Whether this reflects genuine security, geographic advantage from island location, a different conception of power, or simply a gap in what has been found and interpreted, remains an open question. The sea itself was both the condition of Minoan reach and a limit on what the record can recover. Maritime activity leaves less durable evidence than terrestrial activity. Ships do not survive. Docking facilities leave ambiguous archaeological traces. The roots and rhythms of Minoan seafaring have to be inferred from the distribution of material goods, from the presence of Minoan objects in foreign contexts, from the apparent reach of Minoan influence across the Aegean. That influence was real and measurable, but its mechanisms, the organization of fleets, the structure of trading relationships, the identities of the people who sailed, remain largely in shadow. There is a fresco fragment from Akrotiri, the site on Thera, preserved beneath volcanic ash, that shows a fleet of ships in procession between coastal towns. It is one of the most detailed depictions of Bronze Age seafaring to survive anywhere in the Mediterranean world. The ships are clearly rendered, the towns are visible, the landscape has been studied and partially identified, and the occasion for the procession, whether ritual, military, ceremonial, or commercial, is not legible from the image alone. A detailed picture of something whose meaning cannot be confirmed. The archive of Minoan civilization in miniature. There is a site on the eastern end of Crete called Zakros, and what happened there around 1450 BCE is one of the cleaner archaeological facts in a field full of contested interpretations. The palace at Zakros was destroyed, apparently by fire, and it was never reoccupied. What this means in practical terms is that the destruction layer was never disturbed by subsequent habitation. Objects that were in the palace when it burned remained where they fell, covered by collapse, sealed by abandonment. When excavations began at the site in the 1960s under the Greek archaeologist Nikolaos Platon, the finds were remarkable: bronze ingots, elephant tusks, stone rhyta, faience objects, and a large number of linear A tablets, all preserved within the destruction layer in conditions that reflected their original context more faithfully than sites with later occupation could offer. Zakros is, in some ways, the most honest of the Minoan palatial sites. It was not reconstructed by Evans. It was not selectively excavated in the early 20th century before stratigraphic methods were standardized. It was found largely intact within its destruction horizon and excavated with the methods of its time, which were more rigorous than what had come before. The objects from Zakros have clear provenance. Their relationships to one another and to the architecture around them were recorded, and yet Zakros, like every other Minoan site, cannot speak. Its linear A tablets are as unreadable as those from Knossos. Its stone vessels carry inscriptions that cannot be translated. Its destruction, dramatic and well-preserved as it is, does not explain itself. The destruction of Zakros at roughly the same time as the destruction of other Minoan palatial sites, Phaistos, Malaya, smaller centers across Crete, forms a pattern that has driven the invasion hypothesis with particular force. Simultaneous or near-simultaneous destruction across multiple sites, followed by the appearance of Mycenaean Greek administrative presence at Knossos, is the kind of sequence that an invasion narrative fits most naturally. Sites are destroyed. A new power takes control of the most important surviving center. The administrative language changes. The older culture's material traditions gradually disappear or are absorbed. But the invasion hypothesis carries its own unresolved difficulties. There is no clear evidence of a Mycenaean military presence in the destruction layers themselves. No weapons caches that signal conquest, no mass graves of defenders, no burned bodies in postures of conflict. Destruction by fire at ancient sites can result from many causes: deliberate burning by invaders, accidental fires, ritual destruction, earthquake-triggered fires, or some combination. The absence of unambiguous battle evidence does not disprove invasion, but it prevents confirmation, and the field continues to divide on the question. What the period after 1450 BCE shows at Knossos is a culture that appears to be a hybrid. Linear B tablets record an administration functioning in Greek, but the material culture, pottery styles, ritual objects, architectural conventions, shows strong continuities with earlier Minoan practice. This has led some researchers to propose that whatever happened was not a clean replacement of one population by another, but a more complicated process in which Mycenaean elites took administrative control while much of the existing population and many existing cultural practices continued. The result would have been a society that was neither purely Minoan nor purely Mycenaean, but something in between that the available categories do not fully capture. This in-between quality is one of the most persistent features of Minoan civilization in the archaeological record. It resists clean classification at almost every level. Its art is unlike Egyptian art and unlike Mycenaean art, though it influenced both and shares elements with each. Its political organization does not match the palace states of the Near East, though it shares structural features with them. Its religion, to the extent it can be reconstructed, incorporates elements that appear in later Greek practice, but the connections are not direct enough to allow confident lineage. The Minoans sit at the intersection of multiple later traditions without being reducible to any of them. That positioning, influential, absorbed, not quite ancestral to anything, in a direct unbroken line, may be part of why the civilization has attracted such sustained interpretive attention. It sits just before the traditions that shape the Western world as historians have constructed it, close enough to feel relevant, distant enough, and sealed enough to remain genuinely unknown. Every generation of researchers has approached it with the tools and assumptions of their own moment, and every generation has found something that seemed to confirm what they were looking for, alongside something else that would not fit. The something else that would not fit is, in the end, what has kept the inquiry alive, not the answers, the remainder. The island of Thera, now called Santorini, exists today as a crescent of land around a flooded caldera, the collapsed remnant of the volcano that destroyed it sometime in the second millennium BCE. The island's current shape is itself a record of catastrophe, a geography formed by violence so extreme that it remade the landscape permanently. Tourists photograph the caldera from cliff-top towns without necessarily registering that the blue water below them is the interior of a collapsed mountain. The beauty of the place is inseparable from the destruction that made it. Akrotiri, the Minoan-era settlement buried beneath meters of volcanic ash on the southern tip of Thera, was discovered and identified in the late 1960s and has been excavated in stages since then. It is preserved with a completeness that is rare in the ancient world. Multi-story buildings stand to their upper floors, staircases survive, storage vessels remain in the positions where they were last placed. Frescoes cover the walls of private houses with an intimacy that palatial contexts rarely offer, scenes of daily life, of landscape, of human figures in what appear to be domestic and ritual settings, painted on walls in rooms where people lived rather than in ceremonial spaces designed for display. And yet Akrotiri is, in a specific technical sense, not a Minoan site in the strictest classification. Thera was not Crete. Its inhabitants shared significant cultural overlap with Crete. The pottery styles, the fresco traditions, the architectural conventions are closely related, but whether the population of Akrotiri was ethnically, linguistically, or politically identical to the people of Knossos or Zakros is not established. The relationship between Thera and Crete in the Bronze Age may have been colonial or commercial or culturally convergent without political integration. The evidence does not specify the nature of the connection with enough precision to settle the question. This matters because Akrotiri is frequently used as a primary source for understanding Minoan life, and its use as such carries an assumption about homogeneity across the Aegean that the record may not fully support. The frescoes at Akrotiri are extraordinary, and they are often reproduced alongside Gnossian frescoes as though they form a single coherent visual tradition. In broad terms, they do. but in the specific details that would illuminate belief, social organization, and cultural meaning. The differences between sites may be as significant as the similarities, and treating the entire Minoan-adjacent cultural sphere as a single unified civilization may produce a composite image that no single ancient community would have recognized as its own portrait. The absence of human remains at Akrotiri has already been noted, but it bears returning to in this context. When Pompeii was buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, thousands of people were caught by the eruption, and their bodies were preserved, their final postures recorded by the ash that hardened around them. At Akrotiri, the evacuation appears to have been successful. The people left. They took their valuables. They went somewhere. Where they went, whether they survived the eruption's aftermath, whether they integrated into other communities or maintained a distinct identity or simply disappeared into the general population of the Bronze Age Aegean. None of this is known. An entire community walked away from their city before it was buried, and the archaeological record swallowed the rest of their story completely. The Akrotiri frescoes include one panel that has received sustained attention from researchers interested in Minoan geography and self-representation. Known informally as the miniature frieze or the flotilla fresco, it depicts a seascape with ships, coastlines, towns, and human figures in a panoramic composition that stretches across the walls of a single room. The level of topographic detail has led some researchers to propose that it depicts a real landscape, a specific journey, a specific set of places that could, in principle, be identified. Others argue it is a generalized or idealized representation rather than a cartographic record. The debate has not been resolved, and the fresco continues to be read in both directions simultaneously by researchers working from the same visual evidence. What the flotilla fresco does demonstrate, regardless of its interpretive status, is that the people of Akrotiri conceived of their world in spatial and relational terms, as a network of places connected by water, navigated by ships, inhabited by communities that existed in visible relationship to one another. The world the fresco depicts is not a world of isolation. It is a world of connection. Whether that world survived the eruption that buried its most vivid visual record is one of the questions the archaeology cannot answer. The ash that preserved Akrotiri also ended it. What lies beneath the ash gives and withholds in equal measure. The question of Minoan religion is where the record becomes most difficult to handle responsibly, because it is the area where the temptation to fill silence with imagination has historically been strongest, and where the consequences of doing so have been most consequential for how the civilization has been understood. Evan's vision of a goddess-centered Minoan religion, peaceful and matriarchal, shaped scholarly and popular understanding for decades. It also shaped the broader cultural reception of the Minoans in ways that extended well beyond academic archaeology, feeding into 20th century movements that sought ancient precedent for alternative social and spiritual arrangements. The Minoans became, for some, proof that a different kind of civilization had once existed. That use of them was not grounded in evidence sufficient to bear the weight placed upon it. What the evidence does show is a ritual life of considerable complexity. Peak sanctuaries, open-air shrines built on mountain summits across Crete, have been identified at more than 20 locations. They contain votives in large quantities, clay figurines of humans and animals, miniature vessels, bronze objects, objects that appear to have been deposited as offerings over extended periods. The distribution of peak sanctuaries across the Cretan landscape suggests a ritual geography, a pattern of sacred places that organize the relationship between communities and their surrounding terrain. This is not a simple or primitive religious system. It implies calendrical coordination, communal participation, and the kind of institutionalized practice that requires transmission across generations. Cave sanctuaries represent a parallel and partially overlapping category of sacred space. The Cave of Psychro, sometimes identified with the mythological birthplace of Zeus, contains Bronze Age votive deposits that extend across the Minoan and later periods. The Idaean Cave, associated in later tradition with Cretan Zeus, similarly shows evidence of cult activity across a very long chronological span. These continuities between Minoan sacred locations and later Greek religious practice are suggestive, but the nature of the continuity is contested. Whether the same deity, the same story, or the same ritual practice was maintained across the transition from Minoan to Greek culture, or whether later communities reoccupied older sacred sites and reinterpreted them according to their own religious frameworks, cannot be determined from the physical evidence alone. The linear bead tablets from Knossos and from Mycenaean mainland sites do include references to deities whose names appear in later Greek religion, a form of Poseidon, a form of Dionysus, possibly Athena, or a precursor figure. This suggests that some religious content crossed the cultural boundary between Minoan and Mycenaean civilization, or that the Mycenaeans, in absorbing Minoan cultural infrastructure, also absorbed elements of Minoan religious vocabulary. But the tablets record these deities in economic and administrative contexts, as recipients of offerings, as entities whose sanctuaries received allocations of goods, not in theological or narrative contexts. The gods appear in the ledgers, not in the hymns. Whatever stories the Minoans told about their deities, whatever cosmology organized their religious world, is not preserved in any recoverable text. The double axe, which appears so consistently in Minoan sacred contexts, has been interpreted as a symbol of divine authority, as a sacrificial implement, as a symbol of the goddess, as a purely decorative motif, and as a marker of sacred space. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive, and the axe may have carried different meanings in different contexts. What is observable is its ubiquity. It appears on palace walls, on pottery, on seal stones, carved into the stone pillars of the palace itself. At some Minoan sites, real double axes made of bronze or precious metal have been found in what appear to be votive contexts, deposited as offerings. At others, the symbol appears as a painted or incised mark with no surviving physical counterpart. The sign and the object and the symbol all circulate together, reinforcing one another's significance without explaining it. One of the more discussed features of Minoan religious imagery is the tree. Sacred trees, or what appear to be sacred trees, appear in seal stone imagery in contexts that suggest veneration or ritual interaction. Figures are shown grasping or shaking branches, standing before trees in postures that parallel later Greek depictions of divine epiphany, receiving something, a vision, a presence, a force, from the tree itself. Some researchers have interpreted these scenes as depicting a form of nature religion in which divinity was understood as immanent in living things rather than housed in anthropomorphic deities. Others have read the tree scenes as evidence of a specific ritual practice, perhaps ecstatic, perhaps shamanic in character. Others have urged caution about any interpretation that projects too much content onto images that remain contextually unanchored. The caution is warranted, and it is also, after a point, its own kind of limitation. A civilization cannot be studied exclusively by noting what cannot be said about it. At some point the evidence must be pressed, carefully, for what it can yield. The difficulty is knowing where careful pressure ends and wishful construction begins. That line, in Minoan studies, has been crossed many times, in many directions, by researchers who believed they were staying on the right side of it. The palatial period of Minoan civilization, the era of the great palaces, the redistributive economies, the linear A administration, the elaborate fresco programs, lasted roughly 5 centuries, from approximately 1900 BCE to 1450 BCE. 5 centuries is a considerable span of time. It is longer than the entirety of recorded American history. Within that span, the Minoan palatial system was not static. It experienced destruction and rebuilding. The first palaces, sometimes called the Old Palaces or proto-palatial structures, were destroyed around 1700 BCE, apparently by earthquake, and were rebuilt on a larger and more elaborate scale in what archaeologists call the Neopalatial period. That rebuilding produced the Knossos that Evans excavated, the Zakros that Platon uncovered, the Phaistos whose theatrical area and great court still draw visitors to the Massara plain in southern Crete. The destruction and rebuilding around 1700 BCE is itself understudied relative to the final collapse around 1450 BCE. Perhaps because it resolved, the civilization continued, rebuilt, flourished, while the later event did not. But the earlier destruction raises its own questions. An earthquake severe enough to destroy palatial structures across multiple sites simultaneously would have been a catastrophic event for the communities that experienced it. The response to that catastrophe, the decision to rebuild, the organization required to do so, the continuity of administrative and artistic traditions across the destruction horizon, implies institutional resilience and social coherence of a high order. Someone, or some group, held the civilization together through the destruction and directed its reconstruction. Who that was, how authority was organized and transmitted, whether Minoan society had hereditary kingship of the kind attested at contemporaneous Near Eastern courts, or some other form of elite organization, these questions remain genuinely open. Evans proposed a priest-king figure at Knossos, partly on the basis of a fresco fragment he interpreted as depicting a royal figure in a procession. This reconstruction, including the figure's elaborate feathered crown, has been questioned by later researchers. Some have suggested the figure may be female, or that the scene depicts a deity rather than a human ruler, or that the reconstruction of the fresco itself incorporated too much inference to be reliable as evidence. The priest-king remains in the literature and in museum displays as a working hypothesis, but the confidence with which Evans presented it has not survived subsequent scrutiny intact. The question of gender in Minoan social organization is one that the evidence raises insistently without resolving. Female figures are prominent in Minoan art to a degree that is unusual among contemporaneous cultures. They appear in positions of apparent authority in fresco scenes. They are the subjects of elaborate figurines. They are depicted as officiants in what appear to be ritual contexts. Whether this reflects the actual social prominence of women in Minoan society or a religious tradition in which female figures represented divine or semi-divine forces, or an artistic convention that does not map directly onto social reality, is not established. All three possibilities remain open, and the temptation to read Minoan female imagery as direct evidence of matriarchal social organization has been, as already noted, a persistent source of interpretive overreach. Burial evidence offers a partial corrective to the fresco-centered view of Minoan society, but only partial. Minoan burial practices varied across time and region. Communal burial in tholos tombs, round stone structures built partly below ground, was common in the prepalatial period in southern Crete. Later periods show a range of burial types: rock-cut chamber tombs, pythos burials, larnax burials in clay coffins decorated with painted scenes. The grave goods associated with these burials suggest differentiation in wealth and status, but the picture is uneven. Some burials are rich, many are modest. The patterns do not clearly resolve into a hierarchy with a kind of apex that, in other Bronze Age cultures, would be marked by the extraordinary wealth of a royal burial. There is no confirmed Minoan royal tomb. No burial has been identified that matches the scale and wealth of the royal tombs at Mycenae, or the Egyptian pharaonic tradition, or the royal cemetery at Ur. Either the Minoan elite was buried in ways that have not been identified, in locations that have not been found, or in forms that do not survive well, or the concentration of mortuary wealth at the apex of Minoan society was less extreme than in other palatial cultures. Neither explanation is fully satisfying, and neither resolves the question of how Minoan political authority was organized and embodied. The absence of a royal tomb is not proof of the absence of royalty, but it is a gap in a place where the record might reasonably be expected to speak. The ground at Knossos has been excavated extensively, but not exhaustively. There are areas of the site that remain unexcavated or incompletely explored. The palace complex itself is large, and its full extent may not yet be mapped. What lies beneath the reconstructed portions, beneath the concrete Evans added, beneath the layers his excavations did not reach or did not record with sufficient detail? This is not knowable from the current state of the evidence. The site continues to exist as both a resource and a constraint, offering and withholding in the particular way of all places where excavation and reconstruction have shaped each other so thoroughly that separating them requires more information than survives. The Mycenaeans, who appear at Knossos after 1450 BCE, were not strangers to Minoan culture. The relationship between Crete and the Greek mainland had been developing for centuries before the destruction horizon that marks the end of the Neopalatial period. Minoan objects appear in Mycenaean shaft graves at Mycenae itself, in the burials that Heinrich Schliemann excavated in the 1870s and dated, incorrectly as it turned out, to the era of the Trojan War. These shaft graves, now understood to belong to the 16th century BCE, contain Minoan-made objects alongside mainland-produced goods, suggesting that Minoan prestige goods were valued by Mycenaean elites well before any question of political control arose. The relationship was not simply one of conquest preceded by ignorance. It was a relationship of long familiarity, of cultural exchange that flowed in multiple directions before it resolved, if it resolved, into something more asymmetric. This long familiarity complicates the invasion narrative further. If Mycenaean elites had been acquiring Minoan goods, adopting Minoan artistic conventions, and possibly employing Minoan craftspeople for generations before the collapse of the Minoan palaces, then the cultural absorption that followed the destruction horizon was not a sudden rupture, but an acceleration of a process already underway. The Mycenaeans did not encounter Minoan civilization as a wholly foreign system. They encountered it as something they had already partially internalized, already partly made their own, already selectively adopted into their own developing palatial culture. The Linear B script is itself evidence of this relationship. Linear B was adapted from Linear A. The signs were borrowed, modified, and applied to a different language. This adaptation required someone who knew both systems, or at least knew Linear A well enough to see in it the basis for a new administrative script. Whether that person was a Minoan scribe working for a new Mycenaean administration, a Mycenaean who'd been trained in Minoan scribal practice, or someone whose identity does not fit either category cleanly, is not known. But the act of adaptation implies contact, implies transmission, implies a moment of deliberate borrowing that was more than incidental. The Mycenaean palatial system that developed on the Greek mainland, at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and other centers, shares enough structural features with the Minoan palatial system to suggest institutional as well as artistic debt. The redistributive economy recorded in Linear B tablets parallels the redistributive economy implied by Linear A tablets. The palace as economic and administrative center appears in both traditions. Whether the Mycenaeans developed this system independently, derived it from observation of the Minoan model, or acquired it through the same process of cultural absorption that brought Minoan art and objects to mainland graves, is a question the record approaches without quite answering. Pylos is the Mycenaean site that has produced the largest and most informative archive of Linear B tablets, discovered in 1939 by Carl Blegen and extensively studied since. The Pylos tablets, fired and preserved by the destruction of the palace around 1180 BCE, provide a detailed picture of a Mycenaean palatial economy in its final moments, a record of mobilization, of resource allocation, of what appears to be preparation for a threat that the palace did not survive. The tablets record the deployment of rowers, the distribution of bronze, the positioning of watchers along the coast. They read, in the interpretation of many researchers, like the administrative record of a society that knew danger was approaching and was attempting to respond to it. The palace at Pylos was destroyed and never rebuilt, like Zakros. And, like Zakros, its destruction preserved its final state with unusual clarity. But unlike Zakros, the Pylos tablets are readable. They speak in Greek about the last days of a palace. They do not explain what destroyed it. The tablets end before the destruction, their record cut off by the same event that fired them into permanence. But they show a palace in motion, a bureaucracy functioning, a society still organized and responding, right up to the moment it stopped. What the Linear A tablets from Minoan sites might show, if they could be read, is a question that sits beneath any comparison between the two systems. Whether Minoan tablets from destruction layers also record emergency mobilization, also show a palace aware of approaching crisis, also preserve the administrative voice of a civilization in its final operational moments. This cannot be known. The structure of the tablets suggests they were routine administrative records, not crisis documents. But routine administration was also what the Pylos tablets appeared to be, until their content was read and their final entries understood in context. The Minoans may have seen what was coming. They may have had no warning at all. The tablets that might record which of these was true are the same tablets that have not yet yielded their language to any method of analysis so far attempted. The last administrative acts of Minoan palatial civilization are written down. They exist. They are held in museums and studied in photographs and referenced in academic papers, and they have not yet said what they mean. The period after the collapse of Minoan palatial civilization is sometimes called the post-palatial period, a label that describes it entirely in relation to what preceded it, rather than on its own terms. This is not unusual in archaeological nomenclature, but it reflects something real about how the period is understood, as aftermath, as diminishment, as the long shadow cast by a more vivid earlier era. What actually happened on Crete in the centuries following 1450 BCE, how people lived, what they believed, how they organized themselves without the redistributive palace economies that had structured life for 5 centuries, these questions receive considerably less attention than the questions surrounding the collapse itself. Some sites on Crete show continued habitation after the destruction horizon. Knossos itself, under apparent Mycenaean administration, continued to function as a significant center for some period after 1450 BCE, though the duration and nature of that continuation is debated. Some researchers argue the linear B administrative phase at Knossos lasted only a few generations before the palace there too was destroyed or abandoned sometime around 1375 BCE or later, with the precise dating remaining a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. Others place the final destruction of Knossos later, around 1200 BCE, in the same general horizon that saw the collapse of Mycenaean palatial culture across the mainland. The dating of the final Knossos destruction has been one of the more contentious technical debates in Aegean prehistory, touching on questions of ceramic chronology, stratigraphic interpretation, and the reliability of the evidence Evans' excavations produced. The controversy over Knossos' final destruction date is, in miniature, a version of the larger problem that Minoan archaeology consistently presents. The primary excavation of the most important site was conducted in conditions that make it difficult to extract the precise chronological data that later questions require. Evans excavated Knossos over decades with a team that varied in size and expertise, recording finds with the standards of his era, sometimes prioritizing architectural interpretation over stratigraphic documentation. The result is a site of extraordinary richness whose internal chronology is, in certain critical zones, genuinely disputed. Later excavations have refined the picture in places, but cannot fully compensate for what was not recorded in the original work. This is not a criticism unique to Evans or to early 20th century archaeology. It is a structural condition of the discipline. The first excavation of a site determines, in large part, what later researchers can and cannot know about it. At Knossos, that first excavation was conducted by a man with a coherent and powerful interpretive vision who rebuilt what he found alongside excavating it, who made decisions about what was significant and what was not, who wrote the first account of what the site meant. Every subsequent researcher has worked to some extent within the framework Evans established, either accepting, modifying, or arguing against it. The conversation about Knossos is still, in many ways, a conversation with Evans. Outside Knossos, post-palatial Crete shows patterns of settlement that suggest significant disruption to the earlier social order. Some coastal and lowland sites were abandoned. New settlements appeared in more defensible inland and upland locations, a pattern that suggests increased concern for security, though the nature of the threat, external raiding, internal conflict, general instability, cannot be specified from the settlement evidence alone. The population of Crete in the post-palatial period may have declined, though demographic estimates for the prehistoric Aegean carry large uncertainties. The dense network of interdependent communities that the palace economies had supported appears to have simplified, contracted, localized. The material culture of post-palatial Crete shows continuities with earlier Minoan tradition, alongside new influences from the Mycenaean mainland and, later, from the broader changes sweeping the eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. Pottery styles evolved, burial practices shifted. The elaborate fresco programs of the palatial period did not continue at the same scale or quality. The craft specialization that had produced the extraordinary miniature work of Minoan seal stones, the faience figurines, the carved stone vessels, appears to have diminished along with the palatial infrastructure that had supported it. Luxury production requires concentrated wealth and patronage. When the palaces fell, the conditions that had sustained the highest levels of Minoan material culture fell with them. What survived and in what form is harder to trace. Language survives in ways that archaeology cannot directly observe. Ritual practice survives in attenuated or transformed forms that leave ambiguous physical traces. Stories survive in the memories of communities that do not write them down, until eventually they are written down by someone else, in a different language, in a different era, with different purposes. The myths that Greek writers later attached to Crete, the labyrinth, the Minotaur, the tribute of Athenian youths, the craftsman Daedalus, the figure of Minos himself, may carry, somewhere within their later elaborations, a residue of something that was remembered across the long gap between the Minoan world and the world that named it. Or they may not. The gap is long enough and the transformations numerous enough that the residue, if it exists, cannot be confidently identified. Memory is the most perishable archive. It leaves no deposit in the soil, no impression in clay, no pigment on a wall. It simply continues, or it does not, in the minds of people who cannot be interviewed. The end of the Bronze Age across the eastern Mediterranean is one of the most discussed collapses in ancient history, and the Minoan case sits within it as both a precursor and a parallel. Around 1200 BCE, within a span of a few decades, the palatial systems of the Mycenaean mainland, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, and several other major Bronze Age polities all collapsed, were destroyed, or underwent radical transformation. Egypt survived, but in weakened form, and its records from this period mention a group called the Sea Peoples, raiders or migrants or both, whose origins and identities remain debated, as a significant destabilizing force. The near-simultaneous collapse of so many interconnected Bronze Age systems is sometimes called the Late Bronze Age Collapse, and it represents one of the most dramatic and least fully explained discontinuities in the ancient world. The Minoans, having already lost their palatial civilization around 1450 BCE, were not participants in the 1200 BCE collapse in the same way that Mycenae or Ugarit were. Crete experienced its own disruptions around that later horizon, but the distinctive Minoan palatial culture had already been gone for 2.5 centuries by then. In a sense, the Minoans collapsed early before the general collapse, and the question of whether their early collapse was connected to the later one, whether it was a precursor symptom of the same systemic instabilities or a separate event with separate causes, is one that researchers have considered without reaching firm conclusions. The interconnectedness of Bronze Age Mediterranean economies is increasingly well documented. Goods, people, technologies, and ideas moved across the eastern Mediterranean with a regularity and volume that earlier scholarship tended to underestimate. The disruption of that network, whether through the Thera eruption, through the movements of the Sea Peoples, through climate shifts that affected agricultural productivity, through internal political failures, or through some compounding of all these factors, would have had consequences that radiated outward through the network rather than striking individual civilizations in isolation. The Minoans, as one of the most maritimely connected cultures of the Middle Bronze Age, would have been particularly exposed to disruptions in the broader network. This systemic view of Bronze Age collapse offers a framework that accommodates many of the difficulties that single-cause explanations encounter. It does not require a single catastrophic event to explain a pattern of collapse that played out over decades or longer. It allows for regional variation in timing and form. It accounts for the evidence of continued activity at some sites alongside destruction at others, and it fits with the general picture of an interconnected world in which the failure of key nodes could propagate disruption through multiple dependent systems simultaneously. But the systemic view also has a cost, which is that it can dissolve the specificity of individual cases into a general pattern that obscures what is distinctive about each. The Minoan collapse is not simply the Bronze Age collapse minus 2.5 centuries. It has its own particular features: the destruction pattern across Cretan sites, the survival of Knossos, the appearance of linear B, the specific material culture changes that require explanation at the level of Minoan civilization specifically, not only at the level of the broader system. The systemic framework provides context. It does not provide the content of what happened on Crete in the decades around 1450 BCE. What happened on Crete in those decades is, in the current state of the evidence, a question with multiple partially supported answers and no fully supported one. This has been the condition of the question for as long as it has been seriously investigated, and the accumulation of new evidence, new sites, new analytical techniques, new radiocarbon dates, new isotopic studies of human remains, has refined the parameters of the debate without closing it. Each new piece of evidence tends to complicate the picture at least as much as it clarifies it, because the picture being assembled is one whose central panel is missing. The central panel is the written record. Without a readable Minoan literary, historical, or religious text, the civilization can be described in its outlines, but not inhabited from the inside. Its material remains can be catalogued, analyzed, and compared. Its connections to other cultures can be mapped. Its economic organization can be modeled. But the experience of being Minoan, the framework of meaning within which Minoan people understood their lives, their society, their world, remains inaccessible in a way that distinguishes the Minoan case from most other ancient civilizations of comparable complexity and duration. This inaccessibility is not a mystery in the sensational sense. It is simply a condition of loss. Civilizations end. Their records are destroyed or decay or are written in languages that subsequent history does not transmit to anyone capable of reading them. The Minoan case is an extreme instance of a common fate, pushed to an extreme by the particular combination of an undeciphered script, a probable reliance on perishable writing materials, and a collapse that broke the chain of transmission before anything could be handed forward in a recoverable form. What makes it feel like more than simple loss is the scale of what was clearly there. The frescoes alone are sufficient to demonstrate a civilization of genuine sophistication and vitality. Something complex and alive existed here for a very long time, and is now accessible only in fragments that cannot be fully assembled. That disproportion between the evident richness of what was and the poverty of what can be recovered is what gives the Minoan case its particular quality of haunting. There is a practice in Minoan archaeology called horizon analysis, the careful mapping of destruction layers across multiple sites to establish whether damage was simultaneous, sequential, or scattered in ways that might indicate different causes. This kind of analysis requires precise chronological control, which is exactly what Bronze Age archaeology often lacks. Radiocarbon dating carries error margins that can span decades. Ceramic chronology, which uses the stylistic evolution of pottery to establish relative dates, depends on sequences that were themselves constructed partly from sites whose stratigraphy was not always recorded with sufficient precision. The tools for establishing exactly when things happened in the Minoan world are real and improving, but they are not yet sharp enough to resolve the questions that matter most. Isotopic analysis of human skeletal remains has opened a different kind of window into Minoan history. Strontium isotope ratios in tooth enamel preserve a record of where a person lived during childhood, because the isotopic composition of strontium in the body reflects the geology of the local water and food supply. By analyzing the strontium isotopes in skeletal remains from Minoan burial sites and comparing them to the isotopic signatures of different regions, researchers can identify individuals who were not local to the place where they were buried, people who moved, whether voluntarily or not, whether in life or through the transport of remains. This technique has produced evidence of population mobility in Bronze Age Crete that adds complexity to the picture of Minoan society as a relatively bounded island culture. Some skeletal remains from Minoan contexts show isotopic signatures consistent with origins outside Crete, suggesting that the island's population was not ethnically or geographically uniform in the way that earlier scholarship sometimes implied. This is not surprising in the context of a maritime trading culture with extensive connections across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. People moved along the same routes that goods moved. Craftspeople, traders, spouses, slaves, refugees, and administrators all circulated through the Bronze Age world. The isotopic evidence simply makes some of those movements visible in a way that material culture alone cannot. Ancient DNA analysis has added a further dimension to the biological picture of Minoan populations. Studies published in recent years have analyzed genomic material from skeletal remains identified as Minoan in origin and compared the results to contemporaneous populations from mainland Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and other regions. The results have suggested that the Minoan population was genetically most closely related to Neolithic Anatolian farmers, consistent with the population that arrived in Crete during the Neolithic period and developed in relative, though not complete, isolation over subsequent millennia. Later samples show evidence of genetic input from populations associated with the steppe expansions of the 3rd millennium BCE, which also contributed to the ancestry of Mycenaean Greeks and other Bronze Age Aegean populations. These genetic findings have implications for the language question. If the Minoan population was primarily descended from Neolithic Anatolian farmers, the language they spoke may have belonged to a family related to other languages spoken by populations with similar ancestry. Some researchers have explored possible connections between the Minoan language and ancient Anatolian languages, or with other proposed early Aegean language groups. None of these proposals has achieved consensus, and the genetic evidence does not by itself identify a language. Populations with similar ancestry can speak unrelated languages, and language shift can occur without significant population replacement. But the genetic data adds a dimension to the discussion of Minoan origins and connections that was not available to earlier generations of researchers. The combination of isotopic, genetic, and traditional archaeological evidence is producing a more granular picture of Minoan society than was available even a decade ago. That picture is one of a population with deep roots in the Aegean Neolithic, connected through maritime trade to a wide network of contemporaneous cultures, internally diverse in ways that site-specific analysis is beginning to reveal, and subject to both gradual change and periodic disruption across its 5-century palatial period. This is a more complicated picture than the unified, coherent, essentially mysterious civilization of earlier narratives. It is also a more human one, a picture of people subject to the ordinary variability of biology, geography, and circumstance, rather than an undifferentiated ancient other. But the complication and the humanization do not dissolve the central absence. A more granular biological picture of who the Minoans were in terms of ancestry and mobility does not restore their voice. Knowing the approximate geographic origins of a person's childhood does not say what language they spoke, what stories they told, what they feared or hoped for, how they understood the double axes carved into the pillars of their palace or the snake-holding figures in their shrines. The biological record and the archaeological record converge on a population that was real, varied, and historically significant. They do not converge on a meaning. The search for meaning in the Minoan record has always been, at some level, a search conducted in conditions that make its full achievement impossible. Not because the civilization was less than researchers hoped, but because the particular combination of losses, linguistic, textual, contextual, that its history has produced creates a barrier that no single new discovery has yet been sufficient to breach. Each new technique opens a new kind of evidence. Each new kind of evidence illuminates something previously dark, and each illuminated corner reveals more clearly how large the surrounding darkness still is. There is a room in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum on Crete where the Paiustos disk is displayed. The disk is a fired clay object, roughly 16 centimeters in diameter, discovered in 1908 at the Minoan palatial site of Paiustos by the Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier. On both of its faces, arranged in a spiral from the outer edge toward the center, are symbols pressed into the clay using what appear to be pre-made stamps, each symbol a distinct pictographic sign, applied individually to build a sequence that spirals inward in a continuous line. There are 241 tokens on the disk composed of 45 distinct signs. It is the only known object of its kind. No comparable disk has been found anywhere. No parallel object, no fragment of a similar sequence, no second example of the stamped sign system it uses has emerged in more than a century of subsequent excavation across the Aegean. The Phaistos disk is, in the most literal sense, a unique document. It cannot be compared to other examples of its own script because no other examples exist. Whether it is a Minoan object at all, whether it was made on Crete or brought to Crete from somewhere else, has been debated. Its script is not linear A, though it was found at a Minoan site. Its signs are pictographic in a way that differs from the more abstracted linear A system. Some of its signs appear to depict figures, objects, and possibly architectural elements in a representational style that is visually distinctive. The disk is usually dated to the Neopalatial period, roughly 1700 to 1600 BCE, on the basis of the stratigraphic context of its discovery, though even that dating has been questioned by some researchers. The disk has attracted an extraordinary quantity of proposed decipherments over the decades, far more than is typical for an undeciphered text of comparable length. Because it is unique, because there is no corpus of parallel texts, no bilingual inscription, no comparative material that could anchor an interpretation, it is susceptible to a particular kind of interpretive freedom. A researcher with a hypothesis about what language or script system it encodes can apply that hypothesis to the disk's signs without being constrained by a larger body of evidence that would test the hypothesis against additional instances. Proposed readings have ranged from serious academic proposals to elaborate constructions that the scholarly community has not found persuasive. The disk absorbs them all and yields nothing confirmed. It sits in its case in Heraklion behind glass, in a controlled environment, turned to show one face while the other remains invisible to the viewer standing before it. To see both faces requires a reproduction, a photograph, a rotation that the museum display does not provide in a single viewing. The disk presents itself to the public as a partial object, one face forward, one face turned away, its spiral of unread signs beginning somewhere near the rim and ending somewhere near the center, or beginning at the center and ending at the rim. Even the direction of reading is not established with certainty. This is not a metaphor manufactured for the occasion. It is simply how the disk is displayed, and how it was found and how it exists, a single object, entirely alone in its category, showing what it shows without explaining what it means. The signs on it are clear. The object is well preserved. The physical facts of it are not in dispute. And the meaning is as closed as it was on the morning in 1908, when Pernier lifted it from the soil at Phaistos and recognized that he was holding something he did not understand. Minoan civilization leaves its investigators in this position repeatedly, and the Phaistos disk concentrates the condition into a single object. Something was made with care and intention. Something was pressed into clay by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, using a set of prepared stamps that someone had taken the time to create, to organize, to apply, in a sequence that meant something specific to the person applying them, and presumably to the person or persons for whom the object was made. The care is visible, the intention is apparent, the meaning is gone, or not gone perhaps, suspended, held in a form that preserves its shape, while its content waits for a key that may or may not exist somewhere in the unexcavated ground, in an archive not yet found, in a comparative text that has not yet come to light. The history of ancient languages contains instances of scripts that resisted decipherment for centuries before a discovery, a bilingual inscription, a new corpus, a fresh analytical approach, broke them open. Linear B itself was undeciphered until 1952. Egyptian hieroglyphics were unread until the Rosetta Stone was found. The precedents for eventual understanding exist, but the precedents for permanent silence also exist. Some scripts have not been deciphered and may never be. Some languages died without leaving a relative, without producing a bilingual text, without encoding themselves in a form that the subsequent world could unlock. The Minoan language may be one of these. The Phaistos disk may record a text whose meaning the world has permanently lost. These are possibilities the evidence does not rule out. What remains in either case is the object itself. The spiral of signs pressed into clay by someone who is otherwise entirely absent from history. No name, no face, no account of their life or death or the world they inhabited. The signs exist because the clay was fired, and the clay was fired because the building around it burned, and the building burned because of something that happened around 1700 BCE on the southern plain of Crete, something that ended one phase of a civilization that would itself end 2.5 centuries later in ways that are still being argued about. The preservation was accidental. The loss was total in every other direction. And what survives is a spiral that begins or ends at a point that no one living has yet been able to find.